And hi, thank you so much for joining us for this exciting and informational webinar, The Impact of Trauma on the Body and Brain. Some background on the Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care. The mission is to promote national expansion of innovative PCTI programs and services for Holocaust survivors and other older adult victims of trauma. With a grant from the U.S. Administration for Community Living and the Administration on Aging, and funds raised through private philanthropy, the Jewish Federations of North America's Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care awards subgrants to help community-based organizations advance person-centered, trauma-informed supportive services for Holocaust survivors in the United States. PCTI, which is person-centered, trauma-informed, is a holistic approach to wellness that promotes dignity, strength, and empowerment among the Holocaust survivors we support. PCTI Care incorporates knowledge about the role of trauma in Holocaust survivors' lives into programs, policies, and procedures. The objectives of this webinar are to promote an increased understanding among participants about the impact of trauma on the brain and body, to provide participants with an overview of the long-term consequences of trauma on the body, and to provide our participants with best practices that they can use to promote health and well-being in older adults with a history of trauma. I would like to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker will be Laura Hines, and our second speaker will be Dr. Naomi Jones. I will give our speakers a chance to introduce themselves when we begin Laura's presentation. So Laura, if you would like to begin.
Great. Good morning. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Hines. I am a clinical social worker by training, but have spent the last 7 years of my career highly focused on neurobiological development and the impact that trauma has on how it is that we become the social beings that we are. And with that has come a study on the neurobiological components of the brain that are most impacted by trauma and how it is that that then follows us throughout our lifespan. So my conversation with you all today will be talking about the impact of trauma on the brain in a very specific way as we talk about the neuroscience behind it. And I will also overlay the considerations when working with aging adults. Amanda, can you give me the next slide, please? And the next slide. Thank you. So with the time I have with you all today, there are some learning objectives that I'm going to attempt to meet. The first is to define, explore, and highlight trauma, some of the traits of trauma, how it starts in our bodies and brains, and general presentation that you might see in an individual with a significant trauma past, particularly in childhood. I will also touch very lightly on what happens for those adults who experience trauma who might be survivors of the Holocaust, since I know that that is a particular population that we are interested in today. I will also go over some current data regarding the neuroscience on the impact of trauma on how our brain is organized, which we also call brain architecture, on our social development, and some of the psychosocial traits that you will identify in individuals that may have a history of significant trauma. Can I have the next slide, Amanda? Great. So just for the purpose of getting us all on the same page, I'm going to start out just reiterating a little information about how it is that we define trauma and some of the general traits that are ascribed to phenomena that can become traumatic to individuals. So Sandra Bloom, as many of you will likely know, is a homegrown hero here in the greater Philadelphia area, but she's a national scholar when it comes to trauma and is the co-author of the Sanctuary Model. But She once said to me that trauma is when a person's internal resources are overwhelmed by their external circumstances. And I really appreciated, A, the economy of this phrase, but secondarily, I also appreciate the fact that trauma is a very individual experience. That something that might traumatize me might be a walk in a park to someone else, and vice versa. And that it's a person's internal starting point, what it is that they have both neurologically to offer to the situation as well as socially when it comes to navigating a challenge that will dictate whether or not something is just a thing that happened versus a traumatizing event. So that's something important to keep in mind. Can I have the next slide, Amanda? So these are some general traits associated with trauma. The first is that it's sudden and unexpected. It feels like it comes out of nowhere. We're going about our lives, our days, doing things as we typically would, and then this event happens and it's completely derailing. It's often perceived as life-threatening. This will also include severe emotional threat, which I think is important to highlight. I think often people are more comfortable with trauma if we think that, oh, you were in a horrible car accident and you thought you were going to die, or oh, you almost choked to death and you thought you were going to die. But that emotional threat can be just as derailing, if not more so. This is also directly impacted by childhood because children will perceive more things in their environment as being life-threatening than an adult will. A, because of the lack of power that comes with childhood. B, the complete reliance on caregivers, and that's pretty much the luck of the draw, right? So some of us are going to have caregivers that are more effective at protecting us or keeping us safe versus other folks. And another trait of trauma is that when one's previous coping strategies fail. So this is when people start to feel ineffective in their agency. They are trying so hard to overcome this hardship and nothing that they've ever known to work is working, and that leaving a person feeling extremely vulnerable. Another trait of trauma is that it's the result of ongoing, undischarged toxic stress. So we know that stress generally can be considered a good thing. It's what motivates us. Any procrastinators out there will know this, but undischarged toxic stress is the stress that at the end of the day, there's never a finish line. You are still worried, you are still concerned, you are still trying with all of your might, and nothing seems to be making a difference. So instead of taking confidence from the experience, which is what happens when we have a good stress, we wind up taking a sense of helplessness, hopelessness, and victimhood. And then the last trait of trauma that's important for clinicians to keep in mind is that it's often underreported. And there's a lot of reasons why that is, but some of the big ones are sometimes there's cultural expectations as to whether or not you talk about bad things or you quote unquote air your dirty laundry. There's also realities around people becoming so accustomed to traumatizing experiences that they don't think of them as trauma. It's just another day in their lives, so they may not think to speak of it. Another reason is that often trauma is paired with a threat, especially around sexual or physical abuse. So this traumatic thing happens, and if you tell someone, a worse thing will happen. So these are all things that are important for us because we may be working with people who never disclose their trauma history, but still have significant impact from their experiences in childhood and in young adulthood that might have been related to trauma. Can I have the next slide, Amanda? Thank you. So these are 4 ways in which trauma tends to present. The bulk of my conversation with you all will be about the neurological, biological realities when it comes to how trauma impacts our development, but also it will affect our behaviors, our choices. It will affect how we think, how we see the world, the lens through which we see the world and engage with other people. And then it also will have a negative impact on health. Very often, and that's often associated with the coping strategies that people then adopt to manage the bad things that have happened to them, resulting in all sorts of health issues and concerns. And anyone who wants to know more about that can look to the Adverse Childhood Experience, also known as ACE study, for more data and information about that. Amanda, can I have the next slide? Thank you. So talking about the neurological impact of trauma, it's important to note why it is that we're so susceptible to trauma in our childhoods particularly, and why it is that that might follow us for the rest of our lives unless an intervention or support is offered that can help circumvent or mitigate those realities. And the first reason is because we are considered by both the biological and zoological communities to be altricial infants versus precocial infants. And that is a very scientific way of saying that when we are born, our brains are not fully developed. If you see any infant, you know about the growth plates of the skull and how they have that soft spot, also called the fontanelle. And the truth of the matter is that if our brains were to develop in utero, our mothers would be incapable of passing us through the vaginal canal and giving birth. So we have our brains developed outside of the womb, sorry. And that is why we are more susceptible to trauma in our environment versus other species that are considered precocial. So horses, elephants, llamas, any animal that can walk and approach a caregiver within the first hour of life in order to find a nipple, start suckling, follow a herd, they're considered precocial infants because their brains are fully developed when they are born. Now they might still learn skills and have to rely on instincts, but they are not as reliant on caregivers as infants that are altricial are, because we cannot survive without a caregiver taking care of us. The wonderful part about being altricial infants is that we come into the world ready to adapt to whatever the world offers us. So our physical environment, our social environment, we come ready to figure out how it is that we need to survive in that environment. That is only problematic if our environment is particularly chaotic or riddled with traumatic experiences, because then our brains learn to function in a world of trauma that then becomes our go-to, our starting point, the most developed skills in our social armada, in which case that will put us in a worse position to try to function successfully in a world where trauma is not omnipresent, where it isn't around us all of the time. So it's important to know that our brain has two growth spurts. The first is between the age of 0 and 5, and the second between the ages of 12 and 24. And I think we're all very familiar with the 0 to 5. Children go from lumps of life to being walking, talking, toddling, and then age-appropriate learning and socially developmenting, socially astute individuals as they start to grow and develop. But people often miss the second growth spurt, that 12 to 24. This is why some adolescents really seem to not be 100% put together and are very frustrating to adults who are older and fully developed. It is also why adolescents will often be really successful in some aspects of functioning and really not as successful and challenging in some of those other aspects of functioning, because their brains are still developing. So what's important about these two windows of development is that trauma occurring during those time frames is going to be particularly impactful to how it is that a person develops. During the age of 0 to 5, our brain also undergoes what's called a pruning process. And this is where we are born with 100 billion neurons and neural connections. And our brain has to figure out which ones are most important, which ones it's going to nourish and send energy to, as 60% of the metabolic energy produced in infanthood goes to brain development versus 25% as adults. And so during that time, the brain is picking and choosing what is most important to know, how is it most important to be, and nourishing the neurological pathways that enable that behavior. And then the rest of those pathways become diminished and disconnected because they are not deemed as important, so the brain does not nourish them the same way. So this pruning process is important because if you have significant trauma in your childhood, your brain is nourishing and cementing and strengthening those neurological pathways that help you survive trauma and stress. And that then will be your strongest brain muscles when it comes to how it is that you navigate the world. As we will continue to speak, it's harder to navigate the world successfully if you're always in trauma survival mode. So unfortunately, our brains will become accustomed to patterns in our social environment that will follow us throughout our lifespan, again, without any mitigation or intervention if no one comes to our aid in this area. So trauma can impact the development of key parts of the brain, and those effects can span a lifetime. Amanda, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so these are the 4 areas of the brain. Well, 3 of them are in the brain. The pituitary system is controlled by the brain, so I'll speak more on that. But this is how it is that our brains will change in the face of trauma. The first is related to how our brain is quote unquote wired, also called architecture. Other folks also refer to it as mapping. This is when our brain starts to pick and choose what's connected. So if you see an image of a perpetrator who's hurt you repeatedly, then parts of your brain that are tasked with protecting you, survival, escaping, fleeing, fighting back, are going to be stronger and more developed, which means that other entities that look similar to that person are going to then trigger that part of the brain. So this happens with everything. When we see food, when we see loved ones, when we see a car we really like, our brain reacts because of who we are and our historical experiences that have impact our brain's wiring, mapping, or architecture. The other part of the brain that is negatively impacted by trauma is the amygdala, which is also called the alarm system of the brain. So that is what takes data and says, uh-oh, I'm in danger. And it will then send alerts to the central nervous system to enact the sympathetic nervous system and responses. So this is where fight, flight, and freezing, and we've been adding appeasing to that list. That's where this lives. So the fight, I think we're all familiar with that. We're familiar with the fleeing. The freezing is when people try to shut down and disappear from their environment because they're not able to outrun or to fight the danger. So they just try to disappear. The appease is when we essentially supplicate ourselves to the perpetrator or the experience in a hope of surviving it. So your amygdala becomes overreactive and more sensitive if you've had significant trauma, because that was what was required of your early environment. Our prefrontal cortex is the area of our brain towards the front in the frontal lobe, where we self-govern, emotionally regulate, are able to hold and manage rational thought, are able to engage in impulse control, are successful in following step-by-step processes and directions. And we have found that this part of the brain is underdeveloped and sometimes deficient in people who have had significant trauma. The next part of the brain that's impacted is the hippocampus. This is the area responsible for memory creation. So data and information comes in, and it's the hippocampus that helps decide where it will live and how it is that we are to access that information in the future, which means it's a critical component of learning. And we found that people with significant trauma have smaller and less functional hippocampi, and that contributes to some of the problems they have in navigating the world. The pituitary system is what controls our adrenal glands. Our adrenal glands will send out neurochemicals that will support us in times of crisis. But if people are always in crisis or always trying to survive something, that system can become fatigued, which then means people aren't getting the same level of neurochemical support that they would necessarily need in order to be successful in a traumatic situation, because our bodies were not designed to be in trauma all the time. Amanda, can I have the next slide, please? So I just wanted to show this picture of a healthy brain versus a traumatized brain. So on your left, you will see a lot of colors. Red meaning the most active parts of our brain, and black meaning the least active. So in a healthy brain, you see all sorts of light coming from that brain, and that indicates where there are neural connections and neural pathways that are working and are conducting energy and electricity. And that's what's needed for us to be successful in functioning. On the right, you see a brain that has been abused. In this situation, this brain has undergone significant material neglect, so starvation in childhood. But what we know about abused brains in general is that whether it's neglect or physical or sexual abuse, the outcome is very similar. So as you can see, there's a lot less red, it is a lot less colorful, and there's way too much black happening in this brain, which shows literal disconnections of parts of the brain from other parts of the brain, which means that these are areas that are not only deficient but are inactive. So people cannot rely on those parts of the brain in order to navigate the world. The colors that are missing are directly related to the prefrontal cortex. Meanwhile, the red at the base of the skull there is also very connected to where the amygdala resides and our brainstem and our midbrain, which is where our survival, fight, flight, freeze live. So clearly this person is more prepped for reacting and surviving with fight, flight, freeze, and appease than they are for any of the other critical thought processes that happen in the front of the brain. Amanda, can I have the next slide, please? So it's important for us to touch on brain states. So calm brains versus stressed brains are important to reflect on. A calm brain is the brain that is able to do well in school, develop healthy relationships, be successful in social functioning in our society. It has strong access to the prefrontal cortex, therefore has significant opportunity to manage emotions successfully, to engage in rational thought, to be able to understand complex thoughts. The stress brain, however, is mostly solely reliant on our survival instincts. This is not the brain that learns well, a stressed brain. This is not the brain that writes a dissertation. This is the brain that becomes highly reactive, that will cause chaos and conflict and disorganization in a person's life. So if you see down below on this slide, we have the neocortex, limbic brain, reptilian brain. The reptilian brain is the midbrain and the brainstem. This is our most developed parts of the brain when we're born. And it's responsible for breathing, for fighting, for fleeing. The limbic brain is where our emotional or thoughts and feelings reside. So in there you'll see some of the structures associated with that. But the neocortex, that's where rational thought happens. That's the part that develops when we are out of the womb and is most susceptible to damage and challenge once a youth is growing up in a very fraught or traumatizing environment. Can I have the next slide, please, Amanda? Thank you. So all of these things affect how we process things cognitively. So people with significant trauma histories are going to have challenges organizing narrative material, meaning telling their stories. They're going to have a hard time explaining to a doctor exactly when a pain started, for how long, what that pain was like. They're going to have a hard time telling a caseworker the story of their poverty or their challenge or whatever it is that they're trying to present. Their memories are going to be disjointed and come off as less than organized and effective. Unfortunately, that often looks like lying. So people who are having these cognitive processing challenges are often going to be identified as manipulators, liars, people who are just trying to get over because they struggle with organizing narrative material. It also impacts our ability to perceive cause and effect, and this is just directly linked to the fact that if you are experiencing significant trauma, you often did not earn such trauma. So you can be the best little girl or little boy in the whole wide world and still struggle and be faced with trauma, and that then will start to deteriorate your understanding of cause and effect because you won't be able to identify your own personal agency because you weren't able to stop trauma in the past. It also impacts our ability to translate words into action. So giving people instructions like you need to arrive on time doesn't translate into the steps needed in order to arrive on time for people who've had significant trauma. It impacts their ability to plan, to problem solve, to have empathy for another person, because survival is not an empathetic process. It is very self-centered, and if that's what you've had to do your whole life, you have a hard time paying attention to and responding to other people's needs. It impacts your ability to be attentive, to regulate your emotions, to have success in executive functioning, and it challenges your ability to engage in new learning. Can I have the next slide, please, Amanda? So thinking about this in relationship to aging, forgive me, that was my, I've got 5 minutes left reminder. We have the neurobiological considerations and the social. So the neurobiological and physical, these are things that are chemistry, biology bound. So as we age, there is a natural deterioration of neurological pathways. Sometimes it's associated with poor nutrition, people not eating enough healthy, fatty omega-3s, not eating enough of the minerals that we need. Salt is really important, especially as we age, as it is a conductor of electrical current in our brains. Sometimes people's bodies slow down, therefore they become less active, less engaged in their environment, and that will also increase vulnerability when your brain is not being utilized regularly and not reinforcing the neurological pathways that already exist. Dementia will impact a person's ability to access parts of their brain that may not be defective, but if you can't access that part of the brain, then it's not helpful to you. Another thing that often happens is demyelinating diseases. So things like Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's disease, any MS, any of these diseases where the myelin sheath, which helps conduct electricity between neurons, starts to deteriorate. Often people will lose the loss of, will lose their physical coping strategies. So anyone who used to run in order to manage stress, as they age, that's going to be harder for them to do, which means that they're not going to participate in their coping strategies that historically were available to them. There's also memory loss and conflation that can happen, where people are either incapable of accessing memory or they are combining memories. So we'll see things like somebody who sustained sexual abuse or sexual assault now seeing their caregiver or loved one as a perpetrator because their memories are conflating and being combined. We also see an impact on sensory perception, so people hearing less and feeling more vulnerable, which will result in triggers. Biochemical changes impacting physical triggers, so how it is that our brains will slow down, and then that will leave us more susceptible to being triggered by our physical environment. Medical trauma, people get sicker, they need more interventions. Those interventions can have scary traumatic pieces to them as well, which might reawaken old trauma histories or reactions and make that person have a tougher time. We also want to rule out things like mineral deficiencies, whether or not bodies are or are not processing chemicals and the food that we're eating effectively, and pharmacological interference or interactions if people are taking multiple medications. It'd be helpful to have the neurologist kind of look through them and make sure there's not one that's negatively impacting another that's ultimately impacting the brain's functioning. Socially, people lose their social supports, people die. Aging people become more isolated, therefore they don't always have access to the people who brought them comfort and calm. If you were a traumatized individual and that impacted your parenting style, you might have children who are less connected to you. And that will have a tremendous impact on your social supports as you try to age if people don't feel as connected. The impact of survivorship, we know that a lot of folks who are Holocaust survivors, that is a huge part of their identity, and it's something they're asked to revisit and share and talk about repeatedly with multiple groups. And then there are some folks who completely avoid that history, don't ever talk about what happened. Both of these things have a particular impact on how it is that a person is revisiting their trauma history. Elders are also more vulnerable and more socially isolated, and both of those things can increase how it is that they become reactive to their trauma past. Amanda, can I have the next slide, please? So quickly, Memory, we have two versions of memory. We have implicit memory or amygdala-dependent memory. These are memories we don't remember making. These are things that are tied to survival. Like if the first time you ever were in a pool of water, your body learned quite quickly how to hold its breath and keep water out of your nose. You don't necessarily remember making that memory, but your body did it because it was a survival memory. Implicit memory are the things we do remembering. We remember that wedding day because we paid attention and tried to capture some memories and keep them with us. That's considered explicit memory. Trauma has a significant impact on implicit memory. There are things people will remember that they don't remember remembering. And unfortunately, that means that they might have their brains hijacked by those memories, have irrational and dysregulated reactions to things that they didn't even know were troubling to them. This is a significant consideration when it comes to clinical intervention. Amanda, can I have the next slide, please? So this is the last slide, yay. So hope and recovery. Our roles as providers is to recognize and to impart to people that our childhoods, though they have a tremendous impact on us, does not mean that we are not able to create new neurological connections, new ways of cognitive processing. We may need support, routine, and guidance by others, and acceptance and tolerance of when we fall short as we try to practice new behaviors, but our brain is considered to be plastic. So we can learn new ways of processing and reacting to the world around us. We also need to remember that healing is possible, there is hope, and our role in healing as providers is also augmented by making sure that we take care of ourselves so we are most effective in taking care of the people that we are serving.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Naomi?
Thank you. I'm Naomi Jones. I am the Senior Director of Outpatient Services at Jewish Family Service in Atlantic and Cape May County, New Jersey. I oversee our outpatient counseling services as well as our older adult services. And many of our therapists who are providing outpatient counseling are trained in evidence-based practices to assist people impacted by trauma. So that is a large part of the work that we do here. And I'm going to be talking today about the impact of trauma on the body, long-term effects of trauma, and strategies to assist older adults with trauma histories. Next slide. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. So the impact of trauma on the body. So individuals impacted by trauma will experience symptoms immediately after the trauma. And that's just a normal experience because in the face of trauma, our bodies are feeling threatened. And so we respond to that. Bodily sensations and emotions that are associated with threat or danger do continue after the threat is over. For some people, it's just days or weeks. For others, it can last months. And for some, it really can even last their lifetime. So some examples of how the body's impacted by trauma include, next slide, bodily sensations that are related to panic or anxiety, like pounding heart, difficulty breathing or swallowing, experiencing dizziness, nausea or vomiting, uncontrollable trembling and shaking, feeling hot or flushed, and excessively sweating. Next slide. Also, people that are exposed to trauma feel strong senses of anger, and the bodily sensations that are connected to that include feeling red in the face, hot and flushed, shaking in the hands and the body, excessively sweating, breathing rapidly, clenched fists or headaches. Next slide. Sleep disturbances are very common for people impacted by trauma, and it could be trouble falling asleep or waking up early and not being able to fall back asleep, being restless during that sleep cycle, and experiencing nightmares. And the nightmares can actually impact all of it. So some people might not want to go to sleep because they know that they're going to be having nightmares, and and then sometimes when people wake up early, it's from a nightmare, and they're so shooken up by it that they cannot fall back asleep. Next slide, please. Also, hyperarousal is a time when the body's on high alert. So this is an experience that many people impacted by trauma feel. And it could be presented as a hypervigilance. So they're regularly looking for another threat in their environment. Having trouble concentrating. If somebody is consumed with thoughts of their trauma memories or cues, then it can be very hard to focus on something in the day-to-day, and that might not seem near as important as a potential threat. An exaggerated startle response, again, that's just in that fear state, expecting something to go wrong or to be a threat around you. And we've already talked about the sleep disturbances and that anger. Next slide. So older adults have some responses to trauma that are more common in comparison to younger adults. Older adults are more likely to deny symptoms of traumatic stress or to minimize the experience. They might not even acknowledge that it was highly stressful or traumatic for them. Older adults might be more likely to report somatic complaints and less likely to report depression or other psychological symptoms. And older adults tend to have more avoidance as a part of their symptomatology, sleep problems, and hyperarousal in comparison to younger adults. Next slide. Also, older adults can be at higher risk of adverse consequences because when we have other stresses in our life, then any additional stress just causes higher risk or higher symptomatology in response to stress. And some stressors that may already be in existence in an older person's life is social isolation, physical limitations or complications, chronic illness or other medical problems, cognitive impairment, and financial limitations. Next slide. So moving on to long-term effects of trauma. So for individuals who don't feel relief in symptoms shortly after exposure to trauma, so this is the individuals where it might be months or years or a lifetime of experiencing those effects, trauma treatment's available and it's very effective to reduce symptoms. So not everyone needs trauma treatment. There are people that have very good coping skills, strong social supports, who can resolve trauma on their own without any professional help. But for those who are unable to do that, without treatment, the trauma can have lasting effects on their emotional, behavioral, and physical functioning. Next slide. So some of the emotional effects, of course, post-traumatic stress disorder. Depression is highly common and comorbid to PTSD. Experiencing hopelessness. There's a hopelessness that things will ever feel normal or safe again. Also, people have, because they have these intrusions in their thoughts, these memories that are coming, they are hopeless that will ever change. They think that they will always be thinking about their trauma, always be triggered by trauma cues. Emotional numbing. Some people report they don't have feelings. So, although numbing can be something that people use as a survival technique to shut off emotions that might be overwhelming, for some it lasts so long that they don't even identify that they have emotional expression. Guilt is a common effect. People have guilt about what they did that they think contributed or what they didn't do that they should have done to have stopped it. And certainly in our culture, we blame the victim so frequently that we contribute to people's guilt. Shame and poor self-esteem also are emotional effects that are common. Next slide. Behavioral effects include substance abuse. Substance abuse is highly common for people with unresolved trauma. Also withdrawal from family and friends, which is also going to exacerbate people's loneliness and depression. Participation in enjoyable activities significantly declines or doesn't exist. And unfortunately, that means that people have less opportunity to have good feelings, you know, to be in environments where they're going to have fun. And also, you know, if people had an interpersonal trauma, pulling away from family and friends and not engaging in activities is going to make it hard to re-experience that and have some positive interpersonal interactions to correct those fears. Aggressive behaviors become very common. And one of the main reasons is that people are perceiving threats all around them. So they respond aggressively because they think that someone is threatening them, even if it might be something innocuous. And high-risk behaviors. So there are high-risk behaviors listed in the behavioral effects, but others might include shoplifting or promiscuous behaviors. Next slide. Avoidance of people, places, situations, and activities that are trauma reminders. And this could be very deliberate, that someone's aware that this is a trauma reminder and they're avoiding that, but it also could be not in somebody's awareness. They just, no, I don't go there anymore. I don't really have any reason to, and not really connecting or have that insight to know how it's related. Self-injury is common, suicide, and suicide is high in older adults, so aging is a risk factor for suicide, and PTSD is a risk factor for suicide. So when someone is an older adult who also has PTSD, they're at even more risk for attempting suicide. Disordered eating can be associated with trauma, as well as other compulsive behaviors like gambling or overworking. Next slide, please. So medical problems are more likely to occur in individuals impacted by stress and trauma. And the greater the number of adverse experiences, the greater the likelihood of medical problems. And this we know very clearly from the ACE studies that Laura was also referencing. So additionally, people might avoid medical care altogether, especially if they have trauma reminders related to medical care. So then they may have poorer health in general because they're not managing their care. Next slide. So some of the common physical health problems for people impacted by trauma is somatic complaints without a medical condition, gastrointestinal problems, obesity, diabetes, heart disease. Next slide. Cancer, lung disease, liver disease, hepatitis, and dementia. So these are all medical conditions that we wouldn't necessarily think are related to stress and trauma, but they have been demonstrated to be. And dementia, in fact, is almost twice as likely to occur in people impacted by trauma versus people that have not been impacted. Next slide. So what are some strategies that we can use to assist older adults that have trauma histories? There are evidence-based practices for trauma treatment. So 3 in particular that have decades of research showing their effectiveness in reducing symptoms for people impacted by trauma. We have healthy lifestyle choices, which is helpful for anyone that has stress, but including people with traumatic stress, and coping and relaxation skills. Again, that's helpful to anyone, but also people impacted by trauma. Next slide. So here are the 3 evidence-based practices for trauma treatment. And these are very helpful and effective in reducing symptoms, but many people that we try to refer to treatment are concerned that talking about the trauma is going to make it worse instead of help them improve. So some people may need some support and some education around the effectiveness of trauma treatment, and that it is demonstrated, in fact, that processing the trauma and talking through the trauma with a skilled professional has been effective. But prolonged exposure therapy is a model that centers around the avoidance that is so present for most people that have trauma. So they use two types of exposure: in vivo exposure and imaginal exposure, to try to assist people in reversing that avoidance. So in vivo exposure means that they are coming up with behaviors, situations, and activities that the person has been avoiding in response to the trauma, but they're not actually dangerous. And the therapist will go through a hierarchy with the person so that they start with the least stressful, least anxiety provoking, and guide the person through homework assignments to put themselves in those situations that are non-threatening and have a re-experiencing of that place or activity. Imaginal exposure is repeatedly reviewing the trauma memories in detail in order to provide a safe context that they share their story in, and again, re-experience that, where they come to understand that they are no longer in danger and under that threat. Cognitive processing therapy is a model that's based on social cognitive theory. It teaches people how to identify negative thinking and reframe their thoughts, their negative beliefs about themselves and the world, so that they can view things more realistically, just as in any kind of cognitive therapy. But CPT also has a focus on developing coping skills for trauma and stress. And they really understand that, people may experience additional stressors or even additional traumas. Unfortunately, some people have multiple traumas in their life. So giving people the skills so that if something were to happen in the future, that they feel prepared to handle it. And may not need to return to treatment for that. And then EMDR is a therapy that combines clients attending to their trauma memories in brief periods, brief parts of their trauma memories, while simultaneously focusing on an external stimulus that is providing bilateral stimulation. And originally that was a lateral eye movement. So that's where the name came from. But people have done research to show that other types of bilateral stimulation can also be effective in this model. And in EMDR, the therapist also teaches clients some stress relief imagery, other types of strategies to manage emotional distress. So these are two models that give people skills that they can use in other situations as well. Next slide. So for healthy lifestyle choices, as already stated, these are helpful to anyone, but these can be particularly something to remind people about that are experiencing trauma. Keeping to regular routines for sleeping and eating, or some people weren't in regular routines, or their trauma was so early in their life that they don't even have a regular routine in their adulthood. So it may be helping them to plan or initiate regular routines. Also, having nutritious foods entering the body is going to be better for someone than having, eating junk food. So really helping people to choose nutritious diets as they have their regular eating schedule. Exercising is important, and as people age and they may not be able to do the same things that they could do when they were younger, it could be good to explore different ways that people can still exercise. People can walk if they're able to, but there are times that trainers adjust exercise to the aging community, like exercising in a chair yoga or chair aerobics. So helping to identify some resources in the community that older adults can be referred to, or people that don't have as much physical mobility. Volunteering is rewarding, and also it engages people in interpersonal interactions that are positive. So this helps to re-experience social and interpersonal engagement. Developing or enhancing social supports. So for some people, they don't have social supports, and so finding ways that they can engage socially in the community and meet people that might become a support to them. But also this could be helping people reconnect with their loved ones. So if they've been avoiding their family and their friends, just helping them make plans to re-engage. How do you call somebody that you haven't spoken to in years, and try to reconnect with them. And developing a hobby or resuming a favorite activity. So for some people may not have had activities that they really enjoyed, so they might have to develop something, or they may not be able to physically engage in activities that they liked when they were younger, so they may have to come up with a new hobby. But for some, people have been avoiding activities they enjoy. They're perfectly capable, but they have not been doing it because they didn't expect to enjoy themselves. So helping make a plan to re-engage in those activities can be really helpful. Next slide. So in regards to coping and relaxation skills, keeping a journal is very helpful to people, and that can be general, just write or draw about your day each day, but it also could be something more specific, such as guiding someone to write at the end of each day 3 specific things they were grateful for that day. And each day that their 3 things would be unique and specific to that day. So that really helps people to focus on some of their positive experiences and see what they have in their life to be grateful for. Breathing exercises. There's a couple breathing exercises that are very simple to teach people. Belly breathing is just teaching someone to breathe in through their nose, have their hand on their belly, or if they're lying down, they can rest something on their belly so they can feel or see their belly changing as they inhale and exhale, and then directed to breathe out through the mouth and have that be longer than their inhale. And the 4-7-8 breathing is just a way to cue someone to give them a little structure around breathing if it's hard for them to take slow, deep breaths. So breathing in to the count of 4 and holding it for 7 counts, 7 seconds, and breathing out for 7 seconds, and then asking people to repeat that at least 4 times. But they can do it as many times as they need to actually feel the body relax. Mindfulness meditation is another relaxation skill that's very helpful to people. My favorite to do with clients in session is the raisin meditation. I don't know if it's because it's a food item, but it just seems to really click with people well, to be able to go through all the senses with a raisin and really, have the feedback that people give is very powerful about what that was like for them, what they experienced when they paid attention to the raisin. And then tapping is a skill that you use with your fingers to tap on specific meridian endpoints in the body while focusing on thoughts or feelings or physical sensations. And there is a really good book if someone wants to learn more about it, called Tapping In by Laurel Parnell, who's a psychologist, that she can give a better description of how to use that, how to put that in practice. But I have found that it can be helpful to people to have, not just something happening cognitively for them, but a physical activity as well. Seems to help people to focus on that. Next slide. So in conclusion, individuals can be impacted by trauma emotionally, behaviorally, and physically. And for some, the impact can even last a lifetime. But nevertheless, there are treatments and coping skills that are effective in helping people cope and heal. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. So now that both presenters have presented their PowerPoints, we're going to move on to Q&A. So we're going to use the chat function within Zoom. So if you have any questions, you can go to the chat function and type in the questions you have, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. But whatever we don't get to, we will answer later using our Holocaust survivor care email.
Okay, the first question we have is, can hallucination be a side effect of constant trauma?
So I've been thinking about this question. Thank you, Nina, for putting it out there since I saw it flash. One of the things that I would say is it is not directly linked that a person who's had significant trauma will hallucinate. That is just, I just want to make sure that we're talking about hallucinations, which are seeing things that aren't there, versus flashbacks, which are having images of experiences gone by that then appear to someone and can often make them feel as if they're losing touch with reality. So I want to differentiate between the two. But we do know that hallucinations are a psychotic process, and there are levels of depression that are so severe that they can have psychotic features. So it's less that the trauma caused the hallucination versus the trauma may have resulted in severe depression, and that depression got so severe and went for so long without treatment that that person starts to have a psychotic reaction to that. I will say that trauma can also interrupt sleep patterns, as Dr. Jones stated, in which case people might have insomnia, and insomnia can lead to hallucinations. Trauma can result in dissociation, which is a disembodiment process where people feel disconnected from their bodies, but that's not considered a hallucination or a delusion per se versus a coping strategy and mechanism. So I hope that's useful.
Thank you. You mentioned that trauma survivors have a higher risk of getting dementia, but if they had therapy or intervention, what are the chances that they would get dementia, and are there any stats on that? And the last question is, does the risk decrease if they had gotten help to deal with their trauma?
So I think even the research that shows the higher rates of dementia is pretty new. So I'm not aware of research yet checking into whether people who have experienced successful treatment and a reduction in the symptoms, but I would imagine that over time we would see that because if we're having a reduction in the symptoms of trauma because of trauma treatment, then there's less stress on the body and the person, and so probably less likely to have the physical effects, including dementia.
Can you please explain the raisin exercise?
It actually is an exercise where you go through the different senses. So looking closely at the raisin and at its texture, putting it to your ear, moving it around so that you can hear it, smelling it, And of course, I'm going through this quickly. You would go through it slowly with the client, putting it in your mouth, rolling it around to feel the texture and everything with your tongue. How is that different from when you touched it with your hand? And then biting into it to taste it. So you're kind of going through that process with all the senses, and then talking through with the client afterwards what that experience was like for them. But certainly people can do that without, not in therapy. And it is a technique that you could find online. And someone could be taught to do that and could do that on their own as a relaxation technique.
Thank you. Does trauma in older adults have similar effects to trauma in children?
So I can speak to that in terms of neurologically speaking. Trauma in older adulthood generally won't have the same impact on how your brain develops, but it will impact your implicit memory. So you will have reactions tied to that trauma potentially that you don't feel like you have control over, that seem to appear out of nowhere or when you've been triggered. But since our brains are considered fully developed by the age of 24, it's less likely that we will have the same neurological challenges or deficits or changes that a child would have experiencing trauma in those sensitive periods of time.
Thank you. Are there any techniques useful to help people with dementia to lessen the impact of trauma?
So I think that would be the same as the strategies to reduce symptoms of trauma, but trying to adjust some things to help a person that's having memory issues to remember some of the strategies or to guide them through some of the relaxation strategies.
I agree with that. I'd also add sometimes we can get folks connected to an item or a space in a building and reinforce the calm that is available to them via that item or that space repeatedly when they are most lucid, and then utilize that when they are struggling. So sometimes people will start to calm down when wrapped in that blanket that they've already created an association of calm and safety in, even though they're not able to necessarily explain or access all of the data as to why it's calming when they are experiencing either an episode or a more challenging time of day like sundowning, etc.
You mentioned that people use emotional numbing to cope. Can you define what you mean by that? And does that include dissociation?
It does include dissociation, at least. I'm sorry to jump on this. Dissociation is a version of emotional numbing. There are other versions that I'll let Dr. Jones speak to, but we would often put dissociation under the umbrella of emotional numbing.
Do we have? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Was the question what is emotional numbing and whether it's the same as dissociating?
The participant said that they would like to have it defined and what is included under the umbrella of emotional numbing.
Okay. So I think Laura answered what it constitutes, but as far as a definition, it's the lack of experience of an emotion and the lack of, so it's usually self-report of not experiencing or not having emotions connected to an experience.
Great.
And to add to that, this can make it more bearable for people. If they don't have an emotional reaction, they're not carrying that reactivity in their minds, hearts, bodies, souls. So it is a coping mechanism because some people will just shut down feeling anything rather than feel something that is distressing.
Got it. Next question. Do we have an understanding or theory about why trauma is associated with higher rates of dementia later in life?
I think it goes along with the model that it is affecting people medically. So stress, any stress on a person affects their brain, body functioning. It has such a significant impact that it can cause increases in different medical diagnoses, including memory loss.
Okay.
How do you help a survivor deal with nightmares? And the individual is asking about when they are sleeping, like if a client that doesn't sleep well due to nightmares.
What I do to assist people that are having trouble sleeping and having nightmares is talk through sleep hygiene. And part of sleep hygiene is relaxing before going to bed and trying to bring positivity into their minds. So having some of their resources, the people in their life and positive memories that they can recall as a part of that process, and then going to bed relaxed. And it doesn't mean it's going to eliminate nightmares or sleep problems, but it seems to help improve people's sleep.
I'd like to add to that, if I may. I've also found it helpful to have people kind of create a care plan for if they are awoken by nightmares. So how is it that they are going to regain calm and remind themselves that they are in this present moment and that this moment is safe and that this was their brain's effort to process something from the past versus that threat actually being present, so that they then can turn to those things after a nightmare has awoken them so they don't lose out on a whole night of sleep.
Thank you. Is there a way to explain to medical professionals and physical therapists about the impact of trauma on their patients' bodies so that they can treat their patients more effectively? Because sometimes medical staff are not aware of the issue.
All I can say is I've been trying for the past 7 years. When people are open to the information and when I'm invited to continue education for medical providers, I do try to present this information. I get differing levels of acceptance, especially when people start to zone out as I talk about childhood trauma, because they feel like they don't work in pediatrics, so it's not relevant to the work they do. So I really try to get people to understand this information. I think younger doctors are hearing more about it versus doctors who graduated before this neurobiological information was even available, because it's only about 15 years old in terms of the age of the data. So there's going to be a disconnect between who learned it in school versus who didn't.
Naomi, do you have any input on this?
Well, I think of research, that people in the medical field respond well to data. So having studies like the ACEs study is helpful, I think, to present, to try to demonstrate that it's not just someone's opinion, but there's concrete evidence to show this connection.
In addition to the work that our presenters are doing, the JFNA Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care has funded over 80 projects across the United States that are educating folks in their communities, service providers, medical professionals, mental health professionals about this link. And so I encourage you that if you have any questions about wanting to have somebody trained or wanting training yourself, feel free to get in touch with the center and we'll give you that information soon. And we can link you up with another service provider that can provide training on this topic. Any more questions?
So I saw a couple of questions in the question section that I just wanted to touch on if we have a minute. So is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, one of the questions was from Jen McCarthy in reference to residents who collect or hoard things. And the issue with that is that often people identify those things as being a part of them and or a part of their coping. So we can't help them let go of those things until we help them increase other ways of coping and strengthen their sense of self-identity and not needing all of these little things to help define them. And some of that will also entail grief work, because I find grief and trauma go hand in hand. And so helping people grieve the things that they feel that they need and why they need these things can then help them need those things less, is one of the things that I'd say. There's also a question, how do you address fear of employment dismissal, preventing seeking treatment? I get that. Treatment takes time and it takes focus, and I think some people think if they open Pandora's box, they won't survive it. That's when we would teach people skills in compartmentalization, which is how can they revisit this bad thing and then put it away and continue with their lives and control when and how it is that this past re-enters into their life. And if people feel more confident in that skill, they're often more likely open to address the trauma during a work day and feel like they can then go back to work and be successful. And I think people are stronger than they think they are. So often they think they're not going to survive going back in time and looking at things, and we can help cheerlead them into confidence that they can handle. They've already survived so successfully so far. This could be a part of them surviving and thriving into the future.
Thank you so much. I think that was a great last question. To move on to next steps, we won't ignore all the questions that were asked and not gotten to. We will answer them via email later on. And if you have any questions after this webinar ends, you can feel free to email us. So regarding next steps, our new RFP is launching this summer. We're going to send the details out to everybody who signed up for this webinar. It's going to fund new grantees. So we're really looking forward to getting to know some new organizations. Our 2019 training workshop is going to take place in Washington, D.C., September 24th to 25th. Everybody is invited and everyone is welcome. We will send out information about that soon as well. If you have questions for us or either of the speakers, please email us at holocaustcenter@jewishfederations.org. Quick reminders. Please complete the brief webinar evaluation survey in our follow-up email. This will help us better serve you and our cohort and our larger aging services network in creating content that will be helpful for all of you. And for our current subgrantees, please verify your participation in the webinar using the secret word on the screen, and the link to that will be in the follow-up email as well. Thank you so much for joining us. We're hoping that everybody can come to our 2019 training workshop, where you'll receive more great content like what we just heard. Thank you so much to Dr. Naomi Jones and to Laura Hines, and to all of the